Hello everyone. Today we will be reviewing 4 different chess endgame tactics and positions you must know. These positions include rook endgames, winning ideas, and king and pawn endgames. Before we begin, feel free to mention mistakes I made, or questions you have, in the comments. So, in this position, the material is equal, 2 rooks and 3 pawns for each side. However, white has a mate in 2 moves. Can you find it? It's rook d8. The king is stuck on the bank rank, due to its pawns, and the rook on a8 is forced to capture our rook, and then we recapture the rook in checkmate. So, to the next position. In this position, both the queen and the rook are defending black's bank rank. However, we can deflect one of the defenders, leaving black's bank rank vulnerable. So, can you find the winning move? It's queen takes c7. Leaving the queen vulnerable to both the rook and the queen. However, no matter with which piece you capture, rook e8 will lead to a checkmate. So black will have to make room for the king to escape, and lose a bunch of material. So, to the next position. In this position, the tactic is very similar to the previous position. Here, both black's rook and queen defend the bank rank, yet we can forcefully remove one of the defenders. With queen takes d1. So, to the next position we go. Here, white is down a rook for a pawn, but that pawn can become a queen. Can you find the winning move? It's queen takes a8. And if the rook captures the queen, we have rook to d8. Forcing black to capture our rook, and then we promote out pawn with a checkmate. In this position, white has a pawn on the 7th rank, but the black rook defends the promotion. Can you find the winning move white has? First of all, we have to notice that the black rook can't take our pawn, or we would checkmate the black king on the bank rank. So, can you now find the winning move? It's rook to d1. Again, if black takes out pawn, we checkmate with rook to d8, but we also threaten rook to d8 anyways, forcing black to recapture our rook, and then promoting to a queen. Black has to make an escape square for the king, but we play rook to d8, and we win material. And it all comes down to this idea of forcing the rook that defends promotion to capture our checking rook, and promoting on the next move. So now let's go over the Lucena position. The Lucena position is a common rook and pawn endgame position, where both sides have a rook, and the pawn is one square away from promoting to a queen. However, the white king is in the way of the white pawn. If we simply try to move the king away, the black rook will simply check us, until we either go back to the pawn, or move away, which hangs the pawn, or forces us to go back and defend it. So, the first thing we need to do, in order to win this position, is cut off the enemy king. With rook to f1. The second step is to allow out king to make room for the pawn to promote, which we achieve by placing our rook on the 4th or 5th rank. So, let's say the black rook moves to the d file, trying to prevent us from promoting. Here, we move the rook to the 4th rank. And now, whatever move our opponent makes, we move our king to either c7 or e7. If the rook tries to check us, we go forward, but when we reach the d6 square, we have to play king e6 or c6 first, and then when the rook checks us again, we move to d5. And here, we block the rook's check with our rook, rook to d4, and we win the game. It was important to cut off the enemy king, so it couldn't catch our pawn in time. This position is similar to the previous one, but here our rook is on a7, which changes things a bit. We can't play king to e7 right away, since the enemy king would play king to g7, stopping our promotion. So, we have to play king to e8. Now, if the king comes to g7 again, to try and stop our promotion we can still promote, since it's also a discovered and a double check, which prevents the enemy king from capturing our pawn. And if the enemy rook tries to check us when we move to the e-file, we simply block it with our rook. And now, for the king and pawn endgames. Here, we will learn which king and pawn endgames are a draw, and which ones are won, and how to win them. Here, our king is behind the pawn, which is very important, because this position is a draw. If we move anywhere else other than e4, we are going to lose our pawn, but when we move to d4, the enemy king can just go backwards. And now, if we try to move our king to either e5, or c5 the enemy king is just going to blockade our king. If we try to check with the pawn, the black king just comes back to stop it, and we end up in the same position. And here, if we come to d6, it's a stalemate, since the black king has no legal moves, but it's not in check. In this position, our king is in front of the pawn, but the enemy king has the blockade we talked about earlier, that is called opposition, which means it's a draw too. Wherever we go, the king is just going to follow us, and blockade our king. And if we push the pawn, we are just transposing to the previous position. But now, this position is winning, because we have the opposition, and we put black in a zugzwang, which means wherever he goes to, we win. Now, when the black king goes to the side, we play king to the other side. And when the king goes back to the pawns file, we go back to d5, recreating the opposition. And now just repeat the position until the black king is on the last rank. Here, when the enemy king tries to go to c7, we follow it. And here, we push our pawn, creating another blockade, with our king in the pawn. And eventually, we are going to promote our pawn, by repeating the position and tactics I showed you. I hope you enjoyed the video, and leave a like and subscribe if you learned something. I started using this voice, tell me your opinion about it in the comments. See you in the next video.